The hearing room felt like a cathedral built for judgment, not worship. Massive marble columns stretched toward a vaulted ceiling where afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across rows of polished wooden benches. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of old leather, furniture polish, and something else, something electric and dangerous, the unmistakable smell of anticipation before a storm breaks. Camera crews lined the back wall, their equipment humming softly, lenses trained on the empty witness table like rifles waiting for a target to appear. Reporters whispered into their phones, their voices creating a low susurrus of speculation that filled the cavernous space. Senator John Kennedy sat motionless at the committee table, his reading glasses perched low on his nose, eyes scanning a document with the focused intensity of a surgeon studying an X-ray before a delicate operation. He wore a navy suit that hung comfortably on his lean frame, not expensive, not cheap, just perfectly ordinary, the kind of suit a high school principal might wear to graduation. His tie was slightly loosened at the collar, a subtle signal that he was a man who preferred substance over style. Before him lay 3 thick binders, each one sealed with red evidence tape bearing official federal stamps. To his left sat a laptop, its screen dark. To his right, a simple glass of water, untouched. He looked up slowly, removed his glasses, and folded them with methodical precision. His eyes, pale blue and sharp as winter ice, swept across the room, taking inventory of every face, every camera, every exit. He nodded once to himself, a small private gesture, the movement of a chess player who has just confirmed that his opponent has made exactly the mistake he predicted. He reached forward and pressed a button on the microphone in front of him. The speakers crackled to life with a soft pop. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his Louisiana drawl warm and unhurried, like honey poured over gravel. "We are here today to discuss accountability. Not the kind of accountability that gets talked about in campaign speeches or fundraising emails, but real accountability. The kind that follows a person into the night and doesn't let them sleep. The kind that demands answers when the cameras are gone and the applause has faded. The kind that asks one simple question: did you serve the people who trusted you, or did you serve yourself?" He paused, letting the words settle into the room like dust after an explosion. Outside, beyond the heavy oak doors, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the marble corridor. Not the quiet shuffle of a single person, but the thunderous cacophony of an approaching army. The distinctive sharp click-clack of expensive heels on stone, punctuated by the aggressive thump of multiple pairs of dress shoes, the jangle of jewelry, the low murmur of voices building into a crescendo. Kennedy glanced at his watch, a simple Timex with a worn leather band. "She's late," he observed mildly, addressing no one in particular. 43 minutes late to a hearing she was subpoenaed to attend. Some might call that disrespect. I call it strategy. Make them wait, make them wonder, make them afraid. He looked directly at the nearest camera, his expression unchanging. But here's the thing about strategy. It only works if your opponent doesn't know what you're holding. The footsteps grew louder, closer, accompanied now by the unmistakable sound of raised voices, angry voices, chanting voices. The doors to the committee room shuddered as if struck by a battering ram. Security guards stationed at the entrance exchanged nervous glances. One of them reached for his radio, but before he could speak, the doors burst open with such force that they slammed against the interior walls, the boom echoing like a cannon shot. Maxine Waters entered not as a witness, but as a conquering general returning from war. She strode into the center aisle, her head held high, shoulders back, every inch of her 5-foot frame radiating defiance and barely contained fury. At 84 years old, she moved with the kinetic energy of someone half her age, propelled forward by pure willpower and decades of practiced theatricality. Her suit was a brilliant shade of crimson, the color of blood, of revolution, of warning. It was cut with military precision, sharp angles and bold lines that made her look like she was wearing armor. Her hair, An elaborate construction of woven extensions and sculpted curls rose from her head like a crown, adding precious inches to her height and framing her face with an aura of regal authority. Behind her came the entourage, a human shield of 27 people, staffers, lawyers, community activists, personal photographers, and a handful of what could only be described as professional protesters, people whose job was to chant on command and look angry for the cameras. They moved in formation, a choreographed procession designed to intimidate and overwhelm. At the center of this moving fortress, Waters clutched her personal gavel, a custom-made instrument of polished mahogany with gold inlay, its handle wrapped in purple velvet. She raised it high above her head like a scepter, and with each step, she brought it down sharply against her open palm, the crack of wood on flesh creating a rhythmic, threatening drumbeat that announced her arrival. The chanting began immediately as rehearsed. "Hands off Maxine! Hands off Maxine!" The voices were loud, aggressive, deliberately designed to violate every rule of Senate decorum. Waters smiled, a fierce, predatory expression that showed too many teeth. She fed on the chaos, drew strength from the disruption. This was her element. This was power. She marched directly toward the witness table, her eyes locked on Kennedy with the unblinking focus of a cobra preparing to strike. She did not sit in the chair provided for her. Instead, she positioned herself directly in front of Kennedy's table, looming over him despite the fact that he was taller, forcing him to look up at her. The chanting continued, growing louder, more frenzied. "Hands off Maxine! Hands off Maxine!" Senator Kennedy did not move. He did not flinch. He simply looked up at her with an expression of mild curiosity, the way one might observe an interesting species of insect. The contrast was striking, her fury and theatricality against his absolute calm. Finally, when the chanting reached a fever pitch, he leaned forward slightly and spoke into his microphone, his voice cutting through the noise with surprising clarity. "Good morning, Congresswoman Waters," he said pleasantly. "Thank you for joining us. I know you're a very busy woman. Stealing from the poor takes up a lot of time." The room went silent. The chanting stopped abruptly, as if someone had cut a wire. Waters' smile froze on her face, her eyes widening with shock and rage. Several of her entourage gasped audibly. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised, cameras zooming in. Kennedy's expression remained perfectly neutral, but there was a glint in his pale eyes, the faintest suggestion of satisfaction. "What did you just say?" Waters hissed, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. Kennedy adjusted his glasses and consulted his notes. "I said, and I quote myself here to be accurate, that stealing from the poor takes up a lot of time." He looked back up at her. "Did I stutter?" "I don't think I stuttered. My mama always told me to speak clearly." "You," Waters began, her voice rising with each word, "have no right, no authority, no moral standing to question me. I am a 32-year member of Congress. I am a champion of civil rights. I am the voice of the voiceless, the defender of the defenseless. I am Maxine Waters." Kennedy nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, ma'am, you certainly are. And I'm just a simple country lawyer from Louisiana who can't quite figure out how a champion of the poor managed to accumulate a personal fortune of over $18 million on a congressional salary." He tilted his head slightly, the gesture almost apologetic. "Maybe you're just really good at budgeting." A ripple of nervous laughter ran through the press gallery. Waters' face flushed dark red, her hands trembling with rage. "This is an ambush," she declared, turning to address the cameras directly, playing to her natural audience. "This is a racist, sexist, right-wing witch hunt designed to silence a strong black woman who refuses to bow down to the establishment." Kennedy waited patiently for her to finish, his hands folded calmly on the table in front of him. When the last echo of her voice faded, he spoke again, his tone unchanged. "Ma'am, with all due respect, and I mean that sincerely, the only person trying to silence anyone here is you." He gestured to her entourage, still chanting sporadically. "You brought a mob to a Senate hearing. You disrupted official proceedings. You attempted to intimidate this committee. And now you're playing the victim. He leaned back in his chair. That's quite a performance. I'm almost impressed. Waters slammed her gavel down on Kennedy's table with such force that the wood cracked, a thin line appearing down the center of the handle. You want to talk about performance? Let's talk about your performance, Senator. Let's talk about how you've been gunning for me for years. Let's talk about your obsession with destroying powerful women of color. Kennedy smiled, a thin, cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. Ma'am, I don't have an obsession with destroying powerful women of color. I have an obsession with destroying corruption. And you just happen to be one of the most corrupt politicians in Washington, which, let me tell you, is saying something. That's like being the drunkest person at Mardi Gras. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Waters' entourage surged forward, only to be blocked by security. Cameras flashed in a blinding strobe of light. At the center of it all, Waters stood trembling with rage, her carefully constructed image of control crumbling at the edges. Kennedy raised his voice slightly, just enough to cut through the chaos. Now, if everyone could please settle down, we have a lot of ground to cover today. He tapped the thick binders in front of him. I've got bank records, wire transfers, sworn affidavits, photographs, video evidence, and testimony from 17 witnesses. He looked directly at Waters. So let's start at the beginning, shall we? Let's talk about how you've been running one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in congressional history. Let's talk about how you turned public service into a family business. Let's talk about how you've been lying to your constituents for 3 decades. Waters tried to speak, but no words came out. Her mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish drowning in air. For the first time since entering the room, genuine fear flickered across her face. She looked around desperately, searching for an ally, a friendly face, someone to intervene. But the senators on the dais were suddenly very interested in their notes. Her colleagues, the ones who had eagerly sought photo opportunities with her just weeks ago, were now studying the ceiling, the floor, anything to avoid meeting her eyes. Kennedy opened the first binder, the metal ring snapping open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet room. Let's begin with something simple, he said, his voice taking on the rhythm of a storyteller settling in for a long tale. Let's talk about where you live. According to your official congressional disclosure forms, you reside at 2222 Crenshaw Boulevard, Los Angeles, California, a modest apartment in the heart of your district, a place that allows you to stay connected to the people you represent. He looked up at her, his expression innocent. Except you don't live there, do you, Congresswoman? That apartment is a prop, a stage set. You visit it maybe twice a year, always with cameras present, always for a community event. You stay just long enough to take photographs and then you leave. That's a lie, Waters protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Kennedy pressed a button on his laptop. The large screens behind him flickered to life, displaying security camera footage from the entrance of an apartment building. The time-lapse video showed days passing, the timestamp racing forward. The entrance remained empty, unchanged. Then suddenly a flurry of activity. A convoy of black SUVs pulling up, Waters emerging surrounded by her entourage, entering the building, and then, exactly 93 minutes later, emerging again and driving away. The date stamp showed it was the same day she had held a highly publicized community meeting. 93 minutes, Kennedy narrated. That's how long you spent in your district residence on March 15th of this year. Just long enough for the photo op. Just long enough to maintain the fiction. He advanced to the next image. This is footage from May 22nd. He let it play. Same pattern. Arrive with fanfare, stay briefly, leave. June 18th. Same thing. August 3rd. Same thing. The screens now split, showing the modest apartment building on one side and on the other an aerial photograph of a sprawling mansion, a palatial estate of terracotta tiles and manicured gardens, surrounded by high walls and security gates. This, Kennedy said, his voice dripping with contempt, is where you actually live. 6,000 square feet in Hancock Park, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Los Angeles. Purchase price, $4.3 million. Current estimated value, $6.7 million. Waters' lawyer, a thin, nervous man in an expensive suit, jumped to his feet. Senator, I must object. My client's personal residence is not relevant to these proceedings. Kennedy didn't even look at him. Sit down, counselor. Your client's personal residence is extremely relevant when she's been telling her constituents she lives among them while actually living in a mansion with her wealthy neighbors. It's called fraud. He returned his attention to Waters. Your district has a median household income of $38,000 a year. $38,000. Most of your constituents will never see $1 million in their entire lives, let alone $6.7 million. And yet there you are, living like royalty while they struggle to pay rent. I earned that money, Waters shot back, her voice rising defensively. I worked hard my entire life. I deserve to live comfortably. Kennedy nodded slowly. Oh, I'm sure you worked very hard, ma'am. Let's talk about exactly how hard you worked. He opened the second binder. Let's talk about your family business. Let's talk about how you've been using your congressional office as a personal ATM for 30 years. Let's talk about Corinne Waters, your daughter. At the mention of her daughter's name, Waters' entire demeanor changed. The anger drained from her face, replaced by something closer to panic. She reached out and gripped the edge of Kennedy's table, her knuckles going white. Don't you dare, she whispered. Don't you dare bring my daughter into this. Kennedy's voice remained calm, relentless. Corinne Waters is the proprietor of a business called Progressive Connections. For the past 15 years, that business has had exactly one client, you. Your campaign committee has paid your daughter's company over $783,000 for what your disclosure forms describe as slate mailer management services. He looked up at Waters. $783,000, ma'am. That's a lot of mailers. Those are legitimate campaign expenses. Waters insisted, but her voice was shaking now. Kennedy pulled out a document and held it up. This is an invoice from your daughter's company dated October 2019. Amount billed, $42,000 for a single slate mailer. He set it down and pulled out another. This is a quote we obtained from Victory Strategies, one of the largest political consulting firms in California. They offered to produce the exact same mailer for $6,000. He pulled out another document. This is from Grassroots Consulting Group. Their quote, $5,500. Another document, Martinez and Associates, $6,200. He looked directly at Waters, his eyes hard. Your daughter charged 7 times the market rate. That's not a family business, ma'am. That's a money laundering operation. You're taking campaign donations, money given to you by people who believe in your cause, and you're funneling it directly to your daughter. And then he paused for effect. Your daughter gives a portion of it back to you in cash. We have bank records showing deposits into your personal account that correspond exactly with the dates your campaign paid her. The blood drained from Waters' face. She swayed slightly, and for a moment it looked like she might fall. One of her staffers rushed forward to steady her, but she pushed him away violently. Get off me, she hissed. Kennedy wasn't finished. And then there's your grandson. He flipped to another section of the binder. Mickle Moore, age 22. According to your campaign disclosure forms, you've been paying him $65,000 annually for youth outreach coordination. He looked up. Ma'am, your grandson doesn't coordinate anything. He's a college dropout who posts on social media about video games and sneakers. We interviewed 12 people who work in your district office. None of them have ever seen him do any work. Most of them didn't even know he was on the payroll. You're lying, Waters said weakly. You're making this up. Kennedy pressed another button on his laptop. A new video appeared on the screens. It showed a young man, clearly Mickle Moore, sitting in what appeared to be a gaming setup, speaking into a microphone. The timestamp indicated it was recorded during business hours on a Wednesday afternoon. "What's up, guys?" Mikkel's voice boomed from the speakers. "Mikey M here, back with another stream. Today we're going to be grinding through some Warzone matches. But first, let me give a shout-out to my grandma for keeping the checks coming." He laughed, a carefree sound completely oblivious to the implications of his words. "Best job ever, man. Get paid to stay home and game." The video ended. The silence in the room was absolute. Waters looked like she had been struck. Her mouth worked soundlessly, trying to form words that wouldn't come. Kennedy closed the binder with a soft thud. "Your grandson just admitted on a live stream, watched by hundreds of people, that he gets paid to do nothing. And you know what the truly sad part is, Congresswoman? The truly sad part is that the $65,000 a year you pay him for playing video games is more than twice the salary of a starting teacher in your district. More than twice what a nurse makes. More than twice what a police officer earns. You're paying your grandson more than the people who actually serve your community." "This is a witch hunt," Waters said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is an attack on my family." Kennedy leaned forward, his voice dropping to a softer, more dangerous tone. "No, ma'am. An attack on your family would be unjust, unprovoked, and based on lies. This is an investigation based on facts, evidence, and years of documented corruption. There's a difference." He stood up slowly, his full height casting a shadow across the witness table. "And we're just getting started." He walked around his table and approached Waters, stopping just a few feet away. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hatred. "You're finished," Kennedy said quietly, so quietly that only she and the nearest microphones could hear. "You know it. I know it. Everyone in this room knows it. The only question now is how much damage you're going to do on your way down. Are you going to go quietly with some shred of dignity intact, or are you going to burn it all down and take everyone with you?" Waters straightened her spine, summoning the last reserves of her defiance. "I will never surrender to you," she said through gritted teeth. "I will fight you with every breath in my body. I will expose you for the racist, corrupt fraud you are." Kennedy smiled sadly and shook his head. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand. I don't need you to surrender. I already have everything I need to destroy you. The bank records, the wire transfers, the testimonies. It's all here." He gestured to the binders. "The only thing I need from you is to sit there and watch as I present it to the world. You're not on trial here. You're the evidence." He walked back to his table and sat down. "Now," he said, his voice resuming its normal conversational tone, "let's talk about One United Bank. Let's talk about how you used your position on the House Financial Services Committee to secure $12 million in taxpayer bailout money for a failing bank in which your husband held $350,000 in stock. Let's talk about how you personally called the Treasury Secretary to advocate for this bailout, while thousands of banks across America were collapsing and getting no help at all. Let's talk about how you looked your constituents in the eye, people who were losing their homes to foreclosure, and told them you were fighting for them, when in reality you were fighting to protect your husband's investment." Waters tried to speak, but Kennedy raised his hand. "We'll get to your explanations in a moment, ma'am. First, let me present the facts." He opened the third binder. "On September 9, 2008, at 11:43 a.m., you placed a personal phone call to Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson's office. This call lasted 17 minutes. During that call, you specifically requested that One United Bank be included in the TARP bailout program. A new document appeared on the screens, a transcript of the call." Kennedy began to read, his voice taking on a theatrical quality. Quote, "Secretary Paulson, I'm calling about a vital community institution that absolutely cannot be allowed to fail. One United Bank serves the African American community in Los Angeles, and its collapse would be devastating." End quote. He looked up. "Sounds noble, doesn't it? Fighting for your community. Except you left out one tiny detail. You didn't mention that your husband was a major shareholder. You didn't mention that you had a direct financial interest in the bank's survival." "That's taken out of context," Waters protested. Kennedy continued reading. Quote, I know there are concerns about the bank's financial health, but sometimes we need to look beyond the numbers and consider the broader social impact." End quote. He set the document down. "Ma'am, the broader social impact was that your husband's investment was saved while families in your district lost their homes. The numbers you wanted Treasury to look beyond were the numbers showing that One United was one of the most poorly managed, financially unsound banks in the entire country. The numbers showing that bank executives were using corporate funds to buy luxury cars and vacation properties." He pulled out a new set of documents. These are internal FDIC reports on One United Bank, classified at the time but declassified for these proceedings. Let me read you some highlights. Quote, "One United Bank has consistently failed to meet basic financial stability requirements. Management has demonstrated a pattern of reckless decision-making and personal enrichment at the expense of depositors and shareholders. The bank's loan portfolio is among the worst in the nation, with a default rate exceeding 47%. End quote. Kennedy looked directly at Waters. 47%, ma'am. Nearly half of the bank's loans were in default. Any reasonable person would conclude that this bank needed to fail, that it was beyond saving. But you didn't see it that way because you had 350,000 reasons not to." The screens changed again, now showing photographs of lavish properties, luxury vehicles, and extravagant parties. "These are images from One United Bank executives' personal social media accounts," Kennedy narrated, "posted in the months immediately following the $12 million bailout. This is CEO Kevin Cohey at his newly purchased beach house in Malibu. This is CFO Terry Williams at a charity gala wearing jewelry worth approximately $200,000. This is a Ferrari purchased by the bank's chief operating officer. License plate One United." He let the images sink in. While your constituents were being evicted from their homes, while families were living in their cars, while children were going hungry, the executives of the bank you saved were living like kings. And you want to know the worst part, Congresswoman, the absolute worst part. One United ultimately failed anyway. Despite the $12 million bailout, despite your personal intervention, the bank collapsed 3 years later. The money was wasted. 12 million taxpayer dollars flushed down the toilet to briefly delay the inevitable. And in that time, your husband sold his stock, recovered his initial investment, and walked away clean. "That's not true," Waters said desperately. "Sydney lost money on that investment. We both did." Kennedy smiled, the expression cold and humorless. "Ma'am, we have your husband's tax returns. We subpoenaed them. On April 15, 2009, 5 months after the bailout, your husband sold his entire position in One United stock for $412,000. That's $62,000 more than his initial investment. He made a profit while the bank burned, while your voters suffered, while justice died. The weight of the evidence was crushing. Waters' entourage had begun to dissolve, members quietly slipping toward the exits, unwilling to be associated with the unfolding disaster. Even her closest advisors were inching away, their faces pale, their expressions stricken. Kennedy stood again, his voice rising with righteous anger. "You stood on stages and gave speeches about fighting for the little guy. You appeared on television and railed against corporate greed and Wall Street corruption. You wrote op-eds about the need for accountability. And all the while, you were doing exactly what you claimed to oppose. You were using your power to enrich yourself and your family. You were stealing from the very people who trusted you most." He pointed at her, his finger trembling slightly with emotion. "You are everything that's wrong with Washington. Everything that makes Americans hate their government. Every cynical belief that politicians are corrupt, that the system is rigged, that the powerful take care of their own while everyone else suffers. You are living proof that all of it is true." Waters finally broke. The facade of strength shattered completely, and she began to weep, not quiet, dignified tears, but loud, gasping sobs that shook her entire body. Her carefully applied makeup ran in dark streaks down her face. Her elaborate hair, knocked askew during her earlier outburst, now hung at an odd angle, revealing the gray thinning hair beneath. "I gave my life to public service," she choked out between sobs. "I fought for civil rights. I marched with heroes. I stood up to presidents. I am Maxine Waters." Kennedy's voice was quiet now, almost gentle, but no less devastating. "No, ma'am. You were Maxine Waters, past tense. The woman who marched with heroes is dead. She died somewhere along the way, probably around the time you realized you could make money off her memory. What's sitting before this committee now isn't a civil rights icon. It's a criminal who wrapped herself in the legacy of better people to avoid scrutiny." He returned to his seat and looked out at the packed gallery, at the cameras, at the reporters frantically typing on their laptops. "The case I'm presenting today will be referred to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. The charges will include wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, bribery, tax evasion, and violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Each one carries a potential sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison." Waters's head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror. "Prison? You can't, you won't." Kennedy cut her off. "Ma'am, I'm not a prosecutor, I'm not a judge. I'm just a senator from Louisiana who got tired of watching you steal. But the evidence speaks for itself. And federal prosecutors, well, they love evidence like this. Clear, documented, irrefutable evidence of systematic corruption spanning 3 decades. You've given them enough material for 100 trials." He opened a final folder, this one thinner than the others but somehow more ominous. "And then there's the international component. Let's talk about your trips abroad, Congresswoman. Let's talk about the foreign entities that have been very, very interested in maintaining a relationship with a senior member of the House Financial Services Committee." Waters wiped at her face with shaking hands, smearing her makeup further. "You have no right," she whispered hoarsely. Kennedy pulled out a series of photographs, spreading them across the table like playing cards. "June 2016, Bahamas. You attended what your disclosure forms describe as a banking conference. You stayed at the Ocean Club, a 5-star resort. Room cost $4,000 per night. You stayed for 6 nights. Total cost $24,000. He looked up. "Your official travel budget for that year was $8,000. So who paid for the rest?" He didn't wait for an answer. "These gentlemen paid for it." The screens displayed photographs of 3 men in expensive suits standing with Waters at what appeared to be a private dinner. Viktor Kozlov, Russian banking executive with known ties to the Kremlin. Hassan al-Rashid, Saudi financier currently under investigation for money laundering in 7 countries. And Chen Wei, Chinese Communist Party official who runs a state-owned investment fund. He let that information settle. "You met with these 3 men, privately, multiple times during that trip. And within 6 weeks of your return, you introduced legislation that would have substantially weakened oversight of foreign banking operations in the United States. That legislation was about reducing regulatory burden." Waters protested weakly. Kennedy's laugh was harsh, bitter. "Regulatory burden. That's what you call laws designed to prevent money laundering and terrorist financing. Laws designed to protect American citizens from predatory foreign banks." He shook his head. "Ma'am, the only burden you were trying to reduce was the burden on your bank accounts. Because after that trip, we see some very interesting financial activity. New documents appeared on the screens, bank statements with highlighted transactions. Your husband's consulting firm, which hadn't had a client in 3 years, suddenly received a payment of $250,000 from a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands." He traced the highlight with his finger. "We tracked that shell company back through 4 layers of corporate structures. Want to guess where it originated? A bank in Moscow, partially owned by Mr. Kozlov." The room erupted again. Reporters were shouting questions, cameras flashing. Waters's remaining supporters looked stricken, the reality of the situation finally penetrating their loyalty. Several members of the committee who had remained silent throughout the proceedings now leaned forward, their expressions a mixture of shock and disgust. Kennedy raised his voice over the chaos. $250,000, supposedly for consulting services. But your husband never produced a single work product, never submitted a report, never attended a meeting. The money just appeared in his account, and then, mysteriously, $90,000 of it was transferred to a personal account in your name within 2 weeks. He pulled out more documents, his movements now rapid, aggressive, going for the kill. And it gets better. 3 months later, you took another trip, this time to Dubai, supposedly for a women's empowerment conference. You stayed at the Burj Al Arab, one of the most expensive hotels in the world, and you had another private dinner, this time with Mr. Al-Rashid and 6 of his business associates. Waters tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't support her. She collapsed back into her chair, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Within 30 days of that meeting, Kennedy continued relentlessly, your daughter's company received a contract from a Dubai-based investment firm. Amount: $375,000 for marketing services. He looked directly at Waters. Ma'am, your daughter's company has no international presence, no experience in Middle Eastern markets, no expertise whatsoever that would justify that contract. It was a payoff, pure and simple. This is all circumstantial. Waters' lawyer interjected desperately. You're connecting dots that don't connect. Kennedy turned his cold gaze on the lawyer. Counselor, when you have dozens of dots that all point in exactly the same direction, that form a perfect picture of corruption and bribery, those aren't random connections. That's a pattern. That's a conspiracy. That's a federal crime. He returned his attention to Waters, and we haven't even gotten to China yet. At the mention of China, Waters' face went completely white. Her hands gripped the armrests of her chair so tightly her knuckles looked like they might break through her skin. Chen Wei, Kennedy said, pulling out a thick file. Communist Party official. Runs the China Investment Corporation, a sovereign wealth fund with over $1 trillion in assets. You've met with him 7 times over the past 4 years. 7 documented meetings, including 3 in Beijing. He spread photographs across the table, each one showing Waters with Chen Wei in various locations, restaurants, government buildings, lavish estates. And after each meeting, your financial picture improved dramatically. After your first meeting in March 2018, your husband's firm received a contract worth $400,000 from a company called Pacific Bridge Consulting. Sounds American, doesn't it? He smiled darkly. It's not. It's wholly owned by a subsidiary of the China Investment Corporation. Your husband was being paid by the Chinese government. Waters finally found her voice, though it was barely more than a croak. That's not illegal. Consulting work with foreign entities is permitted. Kennedy nodded slowly. You're right, ma'am. It's not illegal to do legitimate consulting work for foreign entities, provided you properly disclose it and don't use your official position to benefit them. But that's not what happened here, is it? He pulled out more documents. In April 2019, you voted against a bill that would have increased scrutiny of Chinese investments in American technology companies. You were one of only 12 Democrats to vote against it. The bill was specifically designed to prevent China from stealing American intellectual property and national security secrets. He let that hang in the air. Your constituents wanted you to protect American interests. Your colleagues expected you to stand up to China, but you voted to help them. And 3 weeks later, your daughter received a payment of $200,000 from a company called Golden Dragon Enterprises, another Chinese shell corporation. The pattern is unmistakable, Kennedy said, his voice rising with anger. Vote the way China wants and your family gets paid. Introduce legislation that benefits foreign banks and money appears in your accounts. Use your position to protect corrupt institutions and your relatives get lucrative contracts. You turned your congressional office into a marketplace where American interests were for sale to the highest bidder. Waters was crying again, but this time there was no defiance in it, only despair. The cameras captured every moment, every tear, every trembling breath. This was the complete destruction of a political career, broadcast live to millions. Kennedy stood once more, gathering his documents. Over the course of your 32 years in Congress, you have accumulated wealth of over $18 million. Your official salary during that time totaled approximately $5.4 million. Even assuming you saved every single penny, lived on nothing, paid no taxes, you're still missing nearly $13 million in explainable income. He held up a thick document. This is a forensic accounting report prepared by the Government Accountability Office. It traces every dollar in and out of your accounts, your husband's accounts, your daughter's accounts, your grandson's accounts. And the conclusion is inescapable. You have been systematically stealing from the American people for 3 decades. The mechanisms varied. Sometimes it was funneling campaign funds to family members. Sometimes it was foreign bribes disguised as consulting fees. Sometimes it was using your influence to secure bailouts for banks where you had financial interests. Sometimes it was taking money from foreign governments in exchange for favorable legislation. But the result was always the same. You got richer while your constituents got poorer. Kennedy walked toward Waters again, and this time she shrank back from him, pressing herself against her chair as if trying to disappear. You represent one of the poorest districts in California, he said quietly. Median household income $38,000. Poverty rate 23%. Unemployment chronically high. Schools failing. Infrastructure crumbling. Crime rampant. And yet you've done nothing to improve their lives. Nothing meaningful. Nothing lasting. Because you were too busy enriching yourself. Too busy taking bribes and kickbacks. Too busy building your mansion and paying your family and protecting your investments. The people who elected you, who trusted you, who believed in you, they got nothing. Worse than nothing. They got betrayed. He returned to his seat one final time. The evidence I've presented today represents thousands of hours of investigative work, federal agents, forensic accountants, international cooperation from law enforcement agencies in 12 countries. We have tracked your money through dozens of shell companies, offshore accounts, and intermediaries. We have witness testimony from bank executives, political consultants, and foreign officials. We have recordings of phone calls, copies of emails, and documentation of face-to-face meetings. The case is ironclad, unbeatable, the kind of case that prosecutors dream about, and it will be referred to the Department of Justice this afternoon with a recommendation for immediate prosecution on 47 separate federal charges. 47 charges, he repeated, each carrying substantial prison time. If convicted on even half of them, you'll spend the rest of your life in federal prison. At 84 years old, that means you'll die behind bars, alone, disgraced, remembered not as a civil rights champion, but as one of the most corrupt politicians in American history. Waters had stopped crying. She sat motionless now, staring at nothing, her face a mask of devastation and defeat. Her entourage was gone, fled like rats from a sinking ship. Her lawyers were frantically whispering to each other, already discussing plea bargains and damage control. The cameras continued rolling, documenting every second of her public execution. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. You know what the saddest part of all this is, Congresswoman? The truly tragic element. You actually did some good once. Back in the beginning, when you were young and idealistic and really did believe in fighting for people, you passed some decent legislation. You stood up to powerful interests when it actually mattered. You were briefly what you claimed to be. But somewhere along the way, you changed. Maybe it was gradual, so slow you didn't notice it happening. Maybe there was a specific moment when you decided that the rules didn't apply to you, that you'd earned the right to take a little extra, that you deserved to be rich because of all your hard work. I don't know when it happened, but it did happen. The idealist became the opportunist. The champion became the thief. Maxine Waters, the civil rights hero, died, and Maxine Waters, the criminal, was born. He gathered his binders, stacking them neatly. This committee will reconvene in 2 weeks to hear testimony from additional witnesses, including your daughter, your husband, and your grandson. They will be offered the opportunity to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced charges. He looked at Waters. I suggest you hire a very good criminal defense attorney, ma'am. You're going to need one. Chairman Grassley, who had sat silently through the entire proceeding, finally spoke. This hearing is adjourned, but before we dismiss, I want to thank Senator Kennedy for his thorough and devastating presentation of evidence. This is oversight at its finest. This is accountability in action, and this sends a message to every corrupt politician in Washington. You are not above the law. You will be caught. You will be prosecuted. You will pay for your crimes. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. Waters flinched at the sound, her body jerking as if she'd been physically struck. She remained seated as people began filing out, unable or unwilling to move, trapped in the wreckage of her destroyed life. Kennedy packed up his materials methodically, taking his time, saying nothing more. He'd said everything that needed saying. The evidence had spoken. Justice, delayed for so long, was finally coming. As he turned to leave, Waters spoke one final time, her voice barely audible. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you do this to me?" Kennedy stopped, turned back to face her. He considered the question for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice soft but clear. "Because somebody had to. Because you've been getting away with this for 30 years while good, honest people suffered. Because every time a politician steals and gets away with it, it makes every other politician think they can too. Because corruption is a cancer that destroys democracy from within, and you, Congresswoman, you're riddled with it." He paused, then added, "But mostly, I did it because those people in your district, the ones you've been stealing from, they deserve better. They deserve a representative who actually represents them instead of robbing them blind. They deserve someone who fights for their interests instead of selling them out to foreign governments. They deserve what you promised them but never delivered, honest representation." Waters had no response. There was nothing left to say. Kennedy walked out of the hearing room, his footsteps echoing in the now nearly empty chamber. Behind him, Maxine Waters sat alone at the witness table, surrounded by the scattered debris of her shattered career, waiting for the federal marshals who would soon arrive to take her into custody. The cameras continued rolling, capturing the final moments of one of the most spectacular political destructions in American history. A woman who had risen from poverty to power, who had marched with heroes and fought for justice, who had inspired millions with her fierce rhetoric and uncompromising stance, reduced to a weeping, broken figure facing decades in prison for the crimes she committed, while pretending to serve the people who trusted her most. The footage went viral within hours. Not minutes, hours, because it was so extensive, so damning, so comprehensive that people needed time to watch all of it, to absorb the magnitude of the corruption that had been exposed. Kennedy Destroys Maxine Waters became the #1 trending topic on every social media platform. The clips were everywhere. Waters arriving with her chanting mob, Kennedy's calm destruction of her defenses, the revelation of foreign bribes, the breakdown and tears, the final devastating conclusion. News networks played it on loop. Conservative media celebrated it as vindication of everything they'd said about Waters for years. Liberal media struggled to respond, unable to defend the indefensible evidence, but unwilling to completely abandon one of their most prominent voices. Moderate outlets focused on the broader implications for congressional corruption and oversight. But the American people, regardless of political affiliation, watched it with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that corruption had finally been exposed and would be punished. Sadness that someone they'd believed in, someone who'd claimed to fight for them, had betrayed them so completely. Within a week, the Department of Justice announced a formal investigation. Within 2 weeks, Waters' daughter, husband, and grandson were subpoenaed. Within a month, Karen Waters had agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity, providing testimony and documentation that filled in every remaining gap in the case against her mother. 6 months after that hearing, Maxine Waters was indicted on 53 federal charges. The trial lasted 4 months. The evidence presented was even more damaging than what Kennedy had revealed in the hearing, with cooperating witnesses providing insider accounts of the corruption that had spanned decades. The jury deliberated for 7 hours, guilty on 49 of 53 counts. The judge, a Obama appointee with an impeccable reputation for fairness, showed no mercy. You violated the sacred trust placed in you by the people who elected you. You betrayed your oath of office. You sold your influence to foreign governments. You stole from the poorest and most vulnerable members of your community. The sentence must reflect the gravity of these crimes. 23 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole, restitution of $12.4 million, forfeiture of all assets acquired through criminal activity, including the mansion in Hancock Park. Maxine Waters, at age 85, was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. She would die in prison, exactly as Kennedy had predicted. The woman who had thundered, "Reclaiming my time," from the congressional floor, who had called for Trump's impeachment daily, who had positioned herself as the voice of resistance and justice, would spend her final years in a 6-by-8-foot cell, her legacy forever destroyed by her own greed. Senator John Kennedy never gloated, never celebrated. When asked about the Waters case, he simply said, "I did my job. The investigators did theirs. The prosecutors did theirs. The jury did theirs. The system worked like it's supposed to work. That's all." But privately, to close colleagues, he admitted satisfaction, not at destroying Waters personally, but at sending a message that echoed through every corridor of power in Washington. Corruption has consequences. Accountability still exists. The law applies to everyone, regardless of how powerful they think they are or how long they've been getting away with it. Other investigations followed. Kennedy's thoroughness had inspired a new generation of oversight, emboldening other senators and representatives to dig deeper into suspicious financial patterns among their colleagues. The GAO expanded its forensic accounting division. The FBI created a specialized unit focused on congressional corruption. The era of casual theft and bribery was ending, replaced by an era where politicians knew they were being watched, tracked, and that eventually the evidence would catch up with them. And somewhere in Washington, another corrupt politician watched the Waters trial and decided to retire rather than face similar exposure. Then another, and another. A dozen retirements over the next election cycle, all citing family concerns or health issues, all really running from the accountability that was finally, belatedly, arriving. The swamp, as politicians love to call it, was being drained. Not completely. Corruption is too deeply embedded in human nature for that, but significantly, noticeably, enough to restore a small measure of faith that the system could still work, that justice could still prevail, that criminals could still be caught and punished regardless of their political connections. And it had all started with a country lawyer from Louisiana who talked slow, smiled often, and had the patience to follow the money until it led him to the truth. A Rhodes Scholar who played the fool so effectively that arrogant criminals underestimated him right up until the moment he destroyed them with their own records, their own words, their own crimes. "Bless your heart, Congresswoman," Kennedy had said at the beginning of that hearing, in that particular Southern way that sounds like sympathy but means something entirely different. He'd meant it as a warning, a promise, a prophecy, and every word of it had come true. If this story of accountability and justice resonated with you, if you believe that corruption must be exposed regardless of who commits it, then I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button, smash it, Let the algorithm know that people want to see content about holding powerful politicians accountable for their crimes. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because we're going to keep bringing you these stories. Stories of corruption exposed. Stories of justice delayed but not denied. Stories of ordinary citizens and determined investigators who refuse to let the powerful get away with betraying the public trust. Share this video with everyone you know. Post it on your social media. Send it to your friends and family. Tag your representatives and senators. Let them know that we're watching, that we care about corruption, that we demand accountability from the people who are supposed to serve us. Leave a comment below telling us what you think. Should more politicians face this level of scrutiny? Are there other cases of corruption that need to be investigated? What reforms would you implement to prevent politicians from stealing from the American people? And if you really want to support this work, consider becoming a channel member or supporting us on Patreon. Independent journalism and political accountability content takes time, resources, and courage. Your support makes it possible for us to keep investigating, keep exposing, keep holding the powerful accountable. Because at the end of the day, democracy only works when the people remain vigilant, when we refuse to accept corruption as normal, when we demand that those who swear oaths to serve us actually keep those oaths or face the consequences. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And remember, they work for us, not the other way around. Never forget that. Never stop demanding accountability. Never stop fighting for justice. Now hit that like button, subscribe, and let's continue this fight together. The truth matters. Justice matters. And we're not going to stop until every corrupt politician knows that their day of reckoning is coming. God bless you, and God bless America.